In the bitter, sprawling landscapes of the Eastern Front, where every village and forest seemed to change hands multiple times, the Germans had grown confident. Their blitzkrieg tactics, honed across Europe, relied on speed, coordination, and the psychological weight of inevitability. Soviet forces were pushed back time and again, and German soldiers began to feel the war was theirs to control. But hidden behind layers of secrecy and innovation, the Soviets were preparing something that would disrupt that perception entirely. A tank unlike anything the Germans had ever faced. A weapon that seemed almost spectral in its appearance. They called it the Ghost Tank, though that name was never officially documented at the time. The Ghost Tank was born out of necessity and ingenuity. Conventional Soviet armor had struggled to match German engineering, and repeated losses had forced commanders to rethink not just tactics, but the very concept of battlefield intimidation. This tank wasn't about brute force alone. It was designed to strike terror and confusion before it even fired a shot. Engineers experimented with new camouflage techniques, modifications that allowed the tank to blend into forests, smoke-filled fields, and even urban rubble. Its design incorporated elements that made it hard to identify at a distance, with silhouettes that mimicked natural terrain or even smaller vehicles until it was too late. Every rivet and curve was calculated to deceive the enemy's eyes and delay their reaction. The first deployments were limited and kept tightly under wraps. Unlike mass-produced T-34s that were sent to every front, the Ghost tank moved in small, elite units. Its crews were hand-picked, trained not only in armor combat but in psychological tactics and battlefield deception. They were instructed to strike suddenly, withdraw, and strike again elsewhere, creating the illusion that Soviet forces were far larger than they actually were. For German soldiers, accustomed to calculating enemy strength with frightening precision, this was disorienting. One moment a sector appeared quiet and unthreatening, and the next a Ghost tank would emerge, firing, advancing, and then disappearing almost as quickly as it came. The first reports from the front described encounters that seemed impossible. Infantry units would suddenly spot armored silhouettes in forests where no tanks had been expected. Artillery units would be forced to reposition repeatedly, unsure where the next strike would come from. In some cases, German commanders overestimated Soviet numbers, holding back entire divisions because they feared ambushes that might not have existed. The Ghost tank's greatest weapon was uncertainty, and that uncertainty spread faster than bullets or shells. What should have been a straightforward advance turned into a cautious, tense maneuvering, giving Soviet forces the precious moments they needed to regroup, reinforce, or retreat strategically. What made the Ghost tank even more remarkable was its ability to operate in multiple terrains where conventional armor struggled. Deep mud, frozen rivers, and forested hills, areas that often slowed or trapped ordinary tanks, were navigated with skill and preparation. The combination of mobility, concealment, and tactical aggression turned these vehicles into near-mythical instruments of war. German soldiers whispered stories about tanks that appeared from nowhere, struck with precision, and vanished as if swallowed by the earth itself. The Ghost tank became a symbol as much as a weapon. A reminder that the Soviets were capable of thinking beyond conventional warfare and turning fear into a force multiplier. Though the Ghost tank's impact was not measured in sheer numbers or destruction alone, it had an outsized effect on the morale and calculations of the German army. Commanders could no longer rely on previous assumptions about Soviet strength or positioning. Each engagement demanded more caution, more reconnaissance, and more resources. In a war where momentum often dictated success, the mere presence of these tanks disrupted German plans, slowed advances, and gave the Soviets breathing space to mount larger operations. In essence, the Ghost tank demonstrated that in war, sometimes the mind is as important a battlefield as the land itself. By the time German forces began to understand the nature of the threat, the Ghost tanks had already shaped engagements across multiple fronts. They were small in number but enormous in impact, appearing almost like legends in soldiers' accounts and reports. What the Soviets had created was more than a vehicle. It was an idea brought to life, a combination of technology, strategy, and psychological warfare that left an indelible mark on the Eastern Front. It was proof that innovation, secrecy, and the element of surprise could turn even the bleakest situation into an opportunity. And that a ghost, once unleashed, could haunt the most formidable armies in the world. The true power of the Ghost tank extended far beyond its mechanical capabilities. On the battlefield, it wasn't just a weapon of armor and firepower. It was a weapon of perception. German commanders had long relied on intelligence, reconnaissance, and experience to predict Soviet movements. They calculated force ratios, assessed terrain, and believed in the predictability of the Red Army. Then the ghost tanks arrived, and suddenly, none of that seemed reliable. Small units appearing out of nowhere created the illusion of overwhelming numbers. Entire sectors were treated with caution that wasn't warranted by the actual forces present. The tank's impact was not measured simply by the destruction it inflicted, but by the psychological pressure it placed on the enemy. Fear, confusion, and uncertainty became extensions of its armor, spreading faster than any shell ever could. Strategically, this uncertainty slowed German advances at critical points along the Eastern Front. In places where the Wehrmacht might have pushed forward with confidence, the sudden appearance of a ghost tank forced hesitation. Infantry had to reorganize. Supply lines were double-checked, and artillery units were redeployed to meet a threat that often vanished as quickly as it appeared. In effect, the ghost tanks bought time. Time that Soviet forces desperately needed to reinforce positions, regroup battered units, and prepare counter-offensives. Even though these tanks were few in number, their impact was magnified by the psychological disruption they caused. A single tank could make an enemy overestimate the size of an entire division, creating tactical advantages far beyond the vehicle's firepower. The tank's influence wasn't limited to individual engagements. German high command began to notice a pattern. Unexpected resistance, delayed operations, and inflated reports of Soviet strength. In response, they were forced to divert resources, slow their momentum, and re-evaluate offensive plans. This cascading effect meant that the ghost tanks were contributing to the broader Soviet strategy, without ever engaging in large-scale battles. By injecting doubt and caution into enemy planning, the Soviets amplified the effect of their more conventional forces. The tank's presence alone changed how the Germans approached the front, making every decision riskier and every advance slower. Moreover, the ghost tank became a symbol of Soviet innovation and adaptability. In a war dominated by overwhelming German production and technological superiority in certain areas, this secret weapon demonstrated that ingenuity could rival quantity. Commanders and soldiers alike were reminded that the Red Army was capable of thinking outside conventional warfare. The tank's success reinforced morale within Soviet ranks as well. Stories of the mysterious, ghost, armored units spread quickly, inspiring troops and reinforcing the idea that even the most desperate circumstances could be turned to advantage with courage and clever tactics. Its psychological effect also influenced the broader course of the war on the Eastern Front. By forcing German units to overestimate Soviet capabilities, the ghost tanks contributed indirectly to major strategic successes. Delayed operations gave the Red Army opportunities to reinforce key positions, prepare for counterattacks, and recover from prior setbacks. German forces, facing threats they could not fully comprehend or predict, lost precious momentum, an element critical in any blitzkrieg-style campaign. The ghost tanks didn't just fight battles. They shaped campaigns by dictating enemy behavior, slowing advances, and buying the Soviets time and space to operate. Even after the war, the ghost tank's legacy remained largely untold, hidden behind layers of secrecy and classified records. Its influence, however, can be traced in the outcomes of engagements where hesitation and miscalculation played decisive roles. The tank illustrates a fundamental truth of warfare. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not by overwhelming force, but by clever use of perception, surprise, and uncertainty. A single, well-deployed weapon can alter the calculations of a massive army, demonstrating that psychological impact can be as decisive as firepower. In the end, the ghost tank proved that innovation, secrecy, and timing could transform the battlefield. Its existence forced the Germans to fight differently, slowed their momentum, and created openings for Soviet forces to exploit. Though small in numbers and largely invisible to history until recently, its strategic impact on the Eastern Front was enormous. The ghost tank wasn't just a machine. It was a force multiplier, a psychological weapon, and a testament to how ingenuity and audacity can change the course of a war. Its story reminds us that in conflict, sometimes the most decisive victories come from what the enemy fears rather than what they see.